Good afternoon. My name is Brenda Ravenscroft, and I'm the Dean of the Schulich School of Music. Welcome to everyone to this first ever at-home homecoming. I'm delighted that you can attend today. One of the primary goals of a school of music such as ours is to train young musicians to be performers. Now, very often that still takes quite a traditional model where there's a master and an apprentice, and doesn't necessarily take into account new knowledge that we have from educational theories or recent findings from research and science. Our goal here is to expand and to enhance that training model. So the Schulich School of Music, together with the Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Music, Media, and Technology, is partnering with experts in faculties across McGill University to create a new multidisciplinary, state-of-the-art experience in training of musicians and other performers. So this environment will apply scientific knowledge to optimize the training that we give to performers and to enable our students to graduate as healthy and as autonomous lifelong learners and performers. Today, Professor Aaron Williamon will talk to us about performance psychology and supporting musician performance at the highest level. Professor Williamon is the director of the Performance Science Program at the Royal College of Music and Imperial College in London. He also is the current holder of the Schulich Dean's Chair here at the Schulich School of Music and is a distinguished visiting scholar. He will speak about the expanding knowledge about what unites top-level performance and how we understand and can cultivate that, thanks in part to recent developments in brain science. Following Professor Williamon's talk, we will have a question and answer period led by Mr. François Lamoureux. Mr. Lamoureux is a professional musician, a filmmaker, a producer, and a recording and mixing specialist. He's also a member of the Schulich School of Music Faculty Advisory Board. Mr. Lamoureux will explore with Professor Williamon the effect of COVID-19 on the performing world and on musicians, and will also help us to reflect on the intersections between music, science, technology, and psychology. I leave you now with Professor Aaron Williamon, who joins us from London.
Thank you for such a warm introduction, and I'm delighted to join you from London today. I'll spend some time in this presentation talking about the core ingredients of how to build and develop effective and internationally acclaimed musicians. Clearly, the Schulich School of Music has a long track record of working with very successful and producing very successful musicians. And I'll look behind the scenes and of how that works, and also propose some new ideas about how McGill and the Schulich School of Music is looking to bring that training to the very state-of-the-art and to 21st century standards. So when we're looking to train musicians at the very highest of international standards, one of the questions that we have to keep asking is how can we develop and really instill musical excellence among our students? And I'd like to start by giving an example taken from the research field, which most of you will have come across at some point. So this is a graph which shows the age in years of musicians from a very famous study carried out in the 90s by the psychologist Anders Ericsson. And on the axis, you see estimated hours of practice. Now, of course, what we know is that to become great in most fields, we have to put the time in. And Ericsson's study, which was the first really to demonstrate this and has been used and applied to other fields, looked at those people who had spent time learning and performing music, who were at an amateur basis and also at an expert level. So what Ericsson and his colleagues found was that effectively by the age of 20, amateur musicians had spent somewhere around 2,000, just under 2,000 hours practicing, and in this case, it was the piano. Okay, so that's a reasonable amount of time, but over 20 years, it's not that much time. And if you compare the hard work put in with experts, we see a radically different picture. So by the time that they were 20, people who were going on to become expert musicians had put in around 10,000 hours of practice. Erickson pointed out that, and you can see in this graph that, of course, at the age of 20, there's a huge gap between the amount of time put into becoming a great musician that the experts had devoted versus the amateurs. But even that gap started to show as early as age 6. So I think this is fairly well established that in order to become a great musician, or in fact, a great surgeon, or ballet dancer, or a fighter pilot, or whatever it may be, you have to put in the time. But if you just take these results for what you see, I think it's possible to make some incorrect conclusions. And I'd like to draw those to your attention now. So one of the first incorrect conclusions that you may see is that if you look at this graph, it looks as though all you need to do is just clock the hours and put in the time. And Erickson and his colleagues and other people clearly have shown that, in fact, it's not just a matter of accumulating time, but it's about putting in the right quality of time. So, of course, with music students at McGill, they will be working very hard to get excellent teaching so that they put the right amount of effort and focus in the practice room, and that translates into success on stage. So the first incorrect conclusion is just that it's about clocking up the time, and that's not correct. The second conclusion, which you may draw just by looking at this graph, which is also not correct, is that it looks as though that the only factor that comes in to affect your acquisition of musical expertise is practice. But in fact, if you begin to look behind the scenes, you'll see a number of very powerful interpersonal catalysts and environmental catalysts that can shape your path to success. Of course, there are issues around motivation and willpower, and there are issues physically as well in terms of one's ability to develop stamina, to have the sort of body shape and size that may help to facilitate or in fact may even hinder performance. So these interpersonal catalysts can help accelerate you on that road, or in fact, they may interfere with your progress. And of course, there are environmental catalysts as well. So the people with whom you're learning, the environment, your ability to access in music, for instance, what are often quite expensive instruments can play a role in whether or not you can actually do well in the field. Okay, so that's our second incorrect assumption, which I hope we can dispel. And the third is that if you take this away, we're just looking at our experts, it looks as though once you get on the track to greatness, then it's smooth sailing all the way up. And any performer will tell you that, in fact, it's never like that. So we have instances where we feel that we're really doing great. We want to accelerate. This is the best thing that we can possibly do, playing music and performing for people. And then, of course, other times we feel really reluctant to take to the stage. We feel that we're unable to perform. And so there's a dynamic and a give and take between thriving and surviving. And it's important to acknowledge that when we're looking to train future generations of musicians and performers in any field. And in fact, what we see if you look across the field of music is that between 15 to 25%, depending on which studies you look at, show that professional musicians can experience debilitating levels of performance anxiety. And I don't want to give the impression that this is something that's reserved just for the beginners. If you look at the biographical accounts of great musicians like Maria Callas, Caruso, Casals, Godofsky, Paderewski, Rachmaninoff, and the list goes on, what you'll find is that there are many, many great musicians who at some point in their careers have had really quite significant questions about whether they want to continue and their relationship between what they do and their audiences. And it's not just about anxiety. We also see within the field that there can be a high degree of physical pain, injury, and discomfort. So again, depending on which studies you look at, you often find that at any given time, professional musicians are experiencing performance-related pain. 60 to 75% of those professional musicians are having to deal with pain that affects how they perform. And if you look at what happens with students, the numbers go up between 70 to 85%. So how does this compare in other fields? Well, it's directly comparable, and in some cases a little bit more than what's reported by people who play contact sports, such as football. The types of injuries that we see and the physical problems that we see among musicians are obviously not quite the same that we would see in other types of contact sports, but we do see quite significant problems of people who have to put in hours of practice or who over practice because they have certain deadlines or concerts coming up, and they don't perhaps have the strategies that allow them to practice as efficiently and effectively as possible. So what I would like to outline for you today is an approach that we're developing in the Schulich School of Music that looks at bringing in a scientific perspective into the training of professional musicians and the support of those students to become independent musicians who are able to take leadership roles within the field, and also to engage effectively with other people in groups, with their co-performers, and to engage their audiences in a way that, that gives them a real impact within the field. And so this is the McGill Performance Science Initiative. And our approach is dominated by two main elements. The first one is a challenge-led approach, where we are developing a portfolio of what we've called challenge-led projects in collaboration with industry, cultural, and health partners. And here we are working with and will continue to develop a network of people to work with to identify and address artistic, scientific, and technological challenges. And by doing this, what we're hoping to do is to create new knowledge and understanding of how to perform, of music, and how to acquire and sustain exceptional level skills. But we also want to challenge the assumptions of existing performance practice. And a scientific perspective within an arts discipline gives us a chance to look again at the whole of those performance practices to see what are we doing and how might we do them better. The second element of our approach, which is distinctive and internationally distinctive, is that we are developing interdisciplinary performance science. Here, we want to have interdisciplinary teams around our performers, and we're looking to draw parallels and to highlight the differences between different performance domains, from the arts to business and on to medicine and science. So I'll take a moment just to elaborate a little bit more about the challenge-led research and about the interdisciplinary performance science. So in terms of our challenge-led research, one of our main grand challenges that we've identified is to enhance the way in which we educate and perform our students. So this is a typical practice room where musicians spend lots of time on their road to excellence, as we've seen in the work by Anders Ericsson. They spend a lot of time acquiring the skills needed to learn the pieces that they have to learn, to also engage with other performers so that when they get to the stage, they are coordinated, they're professional, and they're ready to go. And so you just look at this particular element, this particular environment, and you see that it's pretty drab. It's pretty boring. It's not at all exciting. It's just a functional room that allows you to practice. And then we look at the spaces where musicians have to perform. So immediately we see that this is a dynamic, a very different environment where performers are hearing acoustically very differently from what they are in the practice room. They're able to engage and interact with a different sort of set of people in this space. There can be reputations around these sorts of spaces that mean that the performers feel quite a lot of pressure when they're waiting backstage to go on. So we see a huge gap between the places where musicians learn, where they're educated, and where they actually have to go out and deliver their performances. And if you look at this in a schematic way, what you'll see is that the context in which we practice tends to be quite dull, boring, unexciting. The level of risk that we experience in the practice room is low. And the context, on the other hand, of where we perform is entirely different. It's very dynamic, it's engaging, it's vibrant, and there's a lot more risk involved. And of course, what great schools of music do, and Schulich is leading the way in this, is to try to bridge the gap between where you practice and where you perform by giving you exposure to concert halls and great conductors and other great musicians where you can practice your skills and develop those and hone them in a way that makes you ready to go out onto stage when the opportunity arises. And what we also see is that this gap between where you learn and where you perform is present in many fields. We see this in sports. So here's an example of rowers practicing, and this is where they perform. Surgeons may be faced with practicing in an environment like this with this sort of equipment. But of course, what they really have to do is to perform exceptionally here in the operating theater. We see that business people will go through classes and learn the facts and figures of what they need to know, but then they're thrown out into the performance context and things seem and are indeed very different. So what we're trying to do here in terms of addressing this grand challenge around performance education is to give music students new places where they can practice performing. Now, here in London at the Royal College of Music, we've developed a performance simulation suite. What this allows us to do is to recreate the conditions of performance. So when our students sign up to use this space, they are taken to a green room where they can warm up, they can get dressed for performance, they can get ready to go out on stage. They're met by a backstage manager, and that manager will take them in due course to the backstage area. And in the backstage area, of course, the backstage manager is working with the front of house to ensure that things are ready for the performer to go through the door and to hit the spotlights. So we have recreated that situation. And when the backstage manager gives the cue for the performer to walk out, the doors open, and through those doors, the performer goes. They're hit by spotlights. They see in front of them an active, engaging virtual audience that's life-size and quite noisy. And those people are ready to wait and to listen to the performance that's about to occur. Now, what happens in this scenario is that our performers are outperforming. There are a range of different sounds that we can drop into the space, such as people coughing or sneezing. We might even make a mobile phone go off. But they have a chance to perform without ideally stopping. They have to go through and deliver this. There's very little risk involved because it is a virtual audience. But what we're trying to do is to have video recorders and video cameras around the space, capturing the performance from different angles, so that the student can then take those videos, review how they walked out on stage, how they took a bow, whether they left enough time between that bow and starting the piece, whether they acknowledged the audience appropriately, what was happening, any particular quirks in behavior or patterns of behavior that didn't look quite right when they were performing, and also how they received the audience's applause at the end. So we have a situation here where we can give our students a chance to practice performing. And this is a technique that we're drawing from other fields, such as preparing pilots for flying or preparing surgeons for operating. So this is a scenario where many musicians would have experienced a small audience environment before. We also run another performance simulator where we have a panel of experts, our judges, who greet the performer as they walk in, ask the performer to deliver his or her audition material, listens sometimes positively, or maybe they listen in a less positive way by gesturing or looking around or showing their discomfort, and then they'll give a response reflecting their perceived success of the audition at the end of the audition process. So here again, the point isn't that we're expecting our students necessarily to every time produce absolutely polished auditions and recitals, but we're giving them that space where they can practice performing, where they can begin to explore and to take risks. And over the coming year, we're going to be working across with colleagues at the Schulich School of Music at McGill to develop a similar performance simulation suite so that students there can have also access to a place where they can practice their performing. So that's just one example of work that we're doing already and that could be developed along our grand challenge in performance education. Another grand challenge, which I'll speak much more briefly about, is we've called it performance systems. And of course, for many, many decades now, both musicians and scientists alike have been interested in trying to understand the physical and psychological mechanisms that allow us to perform. Of course, these days we can look to state-of-the-art wireless wearable technology to give us really good data in terms of the electrophysiology of performance. So what's happening with heart rate variability and blood pressure and a range of things like that. We can use motion capture data to look at how the movements of performers when they're out on stage or in the practice room to try to make that more ergonomically effective, or perhaps more less likely to cause injury through repeated movement. So there's a lot of work now that's allowing us to look at new sensors, new wearable technologies, and we look to move into this space. And just in January, with a very quick plug, I'll say that some colleagues and I will be publishing a book with Oxford University Press, where we've started to articulate some of the most recent developments in performing music research from that performance systems point of view. Another grand challenge that we've identified where we see that we need to do more intensive work is in the area of performance health and well-being. I've already said a little bit about the extent of performance anxiety within the profession, and also the extent to which we see performance-related injuries that have an impact within the field. And very recently, we've carried out some studies looking and comparing musicians on instruments that are predominantly requiring a symmetrical playing position versus an asymmetrical playing position. And originally our hypothesis here was that an asymmetrical position maintained over a long period of time would probably be more likely to produce performance-related pain and injury. But in fact, what we found among our sample of musicians in Europe was that the extent to which musicians experience pain is not necessarily related to the instruments they play. This is a widely experienced phenomenon in terms of dealing with pain that we see across musicians, irrespective of their specialism. We've also developed new ways of capturing the data as to where this pain is happening. And interestingly, what we see is that musicians are, for the most part, reporting pain, whether they're men or women, occurring in the neck, the upper back, and the shoulders. Of course, we see some pain in the arms because musicians are sometimes referred to as athletes of the upper body. But this is suggestive of a sort of pattern of results that you would see with people who are spending long hours either sitting or standing in positions that may not have as much dynamic movement as we would like to see. And I think there are many ways in which we can try to prevent this performance-related pain rather than just accepting that musicians have to suffer through it. And the last area of this performance science initiative that I want to touch on is what we've looked at is in terms of interdisciplinary performance science. And here, we absolutely recognize that the sort of performance practices that we see in other fields can directly inform the way in which we train musicians. We also know that there's a lot of good practice that's happening in music that can have a direct impact on other fields as well, including business, sports, medicine, laboratory science, and other areas of the arts. And so whether that's a matter of working in teams with other people or maintaining very precise precision over fine motor skills and communicating non-verbally with co-performers, or in fact, being able to sustain attentional focus for long periods of time, we know that there are characteristics of performance where if you use the lens of performance to examine your field, whether that might be surgery, sports, music, or business, then it gives you a new way of examining the sorts of skills and knowledge that we can actually amplify to do better in what we're working at. So with regard to the Performance Science Initiative, I suppose the question is, well, why is McGill a good place to develop this? And it's really quite simple. There's absolutely an internationally distinctive constellation of expertise at McGill that really will allow this, this initiative to thrive. We know that the Schulich School of Music is a leader of professional music training across Canada and internationally. Kermit, the Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Music, Media, and Technology, is also an internationally leading center for music research. And of course, there's complementary excellence in multiple disciplines across McGill, and that ranges from surgery and surgical education through to kinesiology, psychology, education, engineering, and sports science. And the last question I would like to ask is, why now? Well, the way that music training has evolved over the past few centuries has been very much a matter of looking at a master-apprentice approach. And I think it's time to turn some of that good practice on its head by bringing in state-of-the-art developments across science and educational practices. We also know with recent developments with the COVID-19 pandemic that musicians, performers, other artists are having to engage in different ways. And science and technology can provide absolutely new ways both for performers to do what they do, but also to engage audiences differently and potentially even more effectively. I think it's also important to recognize the role of performance, music performance, but also performance generally within society. And I'll leave my last example here, just pointing to a recent study that I and some colleagues published in the journal Qualitative Health Research. So we did what's called a meta-ethnography, a review across, a large review across 46 existing studies in the field looking at participatory music engagement. So when generally people in the public are taking part in making music, what effect does it have on their health and well-being? So this was one of the largest international studies combining evidence from many other published results with thousands of people. And what we see here is that making music is demonstrably a very effective way to manage emotions, to develop oneself and to learn, to engage with learning throughout one's life. It's also a very effective way to gain rest, relaxation, and respite from what can be a very stressful modern living. And importantly, making music and making music with others is clearly a good way to connect with other people. And in the current time when people are isolating and isolated, I think being able to connect with others is exceptionally important. And the role that musicians play in help facilitating those connections couldn't be or should not be understated. On that basis, I'll stop. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Hey, Aaron, that was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Well, you know, the first thing I noticed from being a performer and making my living at it for many, many years, and being a student at the Schulich School of Music, I can tell you that your analysis or your commentary on the 10,000 hour conundrum, if you will, really was enlightening to me, because there are other things than just the hours. And I think we can't overstate that. And having the right environment is critical. And your work with the performance lab, how much time does it take to set up one of those labs, and how many hours a day do you recommend? Like, what's the purpose, or not the purpose, but what's the fonctionnement of this thing? How does it actually work?
Well, with the lab, our main point was to set this up at low cost and to make sure it was portable. So what we did, I worked with a team of designers who had been working at the medical school at Imperial College, and virtual operating theaters tend to be very expensive to build, very expensive to run. But my colleague, Professor Roger Kneebone, who's professor of surgical education at Imperial College, wanted to develop portable, low-cost simulation suites. So we looked at what they were doing, and they have basically the capacity to have inflatable operating theaters that you can set up anywhere. And as long as you give the performer, the surgeon, the chance to go through all the pre-performance steps, they tend to be drawn into that performance frame of mind. So in developing the performance lab in London, we did a lot of observation behind the scenes at different concert halls, because we want that pre-performance time to feel right and to feel just as special as going out onto a real stage. So we worked hard to set that up. But in fact, it doesn't really take much in terms of fancy equipment and lots of high-end technology to get people to feel that sense of excitement or perhaps anxiety when they're standing backstage and they can overhear the sound of murmuring in the audience, and the lights are different and the temperature's slightly different. So with just a few environmental cues and a backstage manager who is well rehearsed in terms of getting that process to work effectively, you can really draw people into the performance frame of mind. So, and then at that point, when they walk through the door, we need something that's convincing. Again, I didn't have a huge budget to play with, so we did develop some interactive graphics and video material. But otherwise, it's quite scaled back. I mean, the room is blacked out, so the room sort of disappears into that blackness. And then we try to get relatively convincing interactions from the audience or the audition panel that people would normally experience when they go into the real thing.
Well, you mentioned something really critical to me, having passed my performance exams at McGill and going out into the real world. There is a big difference between adjudication and performance. And if you can simulate both, the student will win, because it is not the same when you have, a semi-large crowd where you have 3 or 4 people in front of you. It's a very different reaction in your playing. Have you noticed the same thing?
Yes, absolutely. What we do see is that many of our performers, when they're going into an audition, the dial is turned up quite considerably, because the expectation is that those experts are there to really focus their lenses on what you're doing, and to judge and to pass comment and so on. So I think the level of anxiety or the level of difference is pretty high there. And we measure this, if you look at heart rate variability and data around the physiology of stress, we see that it's quite clearly different. But for me, in terms of looking at that sort of stress reactivity to a performance situation, there's a lot that you can do. What we have seen in our data is that the pre-performance period is a point where the physiology is really changing. So we have a real peak level of physiological interaction in that pre-performance period. When people are waiting around, they can't do anything to release that excitement and that energy. They just have to wait. And here we see a building up of things like the physiological parameters of stress. Now that's interesting, because that means that there's a period before people are on stage where we know that stress is going to be particularly high, where we can actually intervene to help them control it and manage it better. So there's many studies that, in fact, we're planning to do one this year at McGill, looking at changes in heart rate variability and also breathing patterns. But there are many studies that can be done to help people react better to stress. And the other element, of course, is what happens after the performance. So how do you recover from stress? And you'll know very well that, if you've got performances on back-to-back nights, I mean, you don't want to have a life-changing event on the first night, and then you're spent for the rest of the week because you've got to keep performing. And so what we have seen, for instance, with our audition panel, is that if the panel listens to a performance and they give a sort of so-so review, or they're actually quite negative, that has a direct impact on the speed of recovery from that stressful event for our musicians. So again, because it's off stage, it's an easy period where we can intervene and help people to manage the recovery from stress better as well.
Before getting on to the COVID and how it affects everything, I'd like to get your insight very quickly on one key thing that I think the lab would be so helpful, and I'm sure it already is the idea that the performer has their own grading of their performance, which often is not reality. Mm-hmm. And when they watch it back, they go, I thought I played much better than that. And then they see it and they go, I thought I played much worse than that. Have you experienced that as well?
Yes, we see that musicians, we have done quite large-scale studies looking at qualities like perfectionism. And it's good to be, to have high standards, but it's also not so good if those high standards drive you to practice too much or to worry too much. And we see that musicians score high both on the good and the bad side of perfectionism. And of course, when you're coming off stage, it's really hard to look at something objectively when you've been through this experience where you're physically and psychologically in a different place. So the way that we try to manage this in our performance simulation lab is that we have video recordings. We have our students watch those recordings, but not immediately. We also get them to, so they can reflect and review that. They can do that with one of our team or with their teacher, their instrumental or vocal teacher. And we want them to think first about the things that went right about the performance. So what do I want to take from that? What were the good things? And developing that pattern, that habit of thinking positively first. It sounds trivial, but to be honest, in practice, it's not trivial. So we want people to get into the practice of doing that positive, constructive review instead of a destructive review that happens just immediately when you've walked off stage.
That's amazing. And seeing that we're now in the era of COVID, which will not last forever, but it is a significant blip that it will appear on graphs for, many, many years to come. We'll talk about this. What's the new data on the impact of COVID on the well-being of musicians?
Yeah, so this is really a very important point here. So just in the past, since March of this year, when many countries around the world were going into various stages of lockdown, an international team that we were putting together, including Isabel Cosette at McGill, me and colleagues, not only in the UK, but also Australia, we were looking at the extent to which the COVID-19 pandemic has had a direct impact on the work and the well-being of performing artists. So, as you might expect, we see the clear-cut findings are that most performing artists, because performing opportunities were completely stopped for long periods of time, and in some cases they still are, they were suffering financial hardship, huge losses, and the more direct the financial hit, the more this had an impact on mental health. So that's clear. Now, so we saw that performing work pretty much dried up. Across our sample of several hundred performing artists based in the UK, a lot of their teaching work had gone down, their assessing work had gone down, work across all of the whole portfolio. They were able to regain some of that work through online activity, mainly in terms of their teaching and in terms of assessing and reviewing other people's work. So that there's a little sign of entrepreneurial activity moving online from what was previously offline material. But across the board, what we also see in terms of their mental health was that there were significant increases in loneliness and significant increases in anxiety across most musicians. Now, what I find interesting in that is that we also saw that those musicians who went into this period with better self-rated health tended to weather the storm better. So there, we didn't see quite the detrimental change in mental health as with others. And interestingly as well, for those who were maintaining levels of exercise at pre-COVID periods, they maintained during the lockdown phase, we also saw less decreases in mental health outcome measures. So this highlights the point that firstly, we need to ensure that when we are training young aspiring musicians, that health and well-being is a central part of the message that we're engaging there. And developing, helping musicians to develop those strategies to be in better physical health can have a direct impact, not only on helping them, physically engage with the tasks of practicing and performing better, but it can also help to weather these variable changes and these sort of calamities that we might see approaching that have potential mental health impacts.
Wow, it's just absolutely fascinating. And you mentioned earlier also in your presentation, and I guess in COVID, people have been listening to a lot of music. Can you characterize the difference between making music and listening to music? Does the data show any stuff that we should know about that you found?
Well, in terms of public health interaction with making and listening to music, most of our research, we do now have a study. We've been collecting data with 10,000 people in the UK. The data are in, and we are currently analyzing those data in terms of how their consumption of the arts has changed, whether that's through engagement and participation or whether it's through listening. Just as a preview for that, as we have seen largely with streaming services for videos, films, and music, that maintains pretty healthy levels. With engaging in participatory activities, people can practice their instruments at home. They can still make music, but the really interesting area of making music with other people has had a huge impact. And I think this is incredibly important. This presents us with some really serious public health challenges. So we know on the one hand that making and engaging with music, whether listening or performing, has a very positive impact on health and well-being for the general public, and also particular impacts for, we've shown in studies with mental health service users, with new moms with postnatal depression, with older adults who are living in nursing homes. Music is an important part of life, and it has a really direct and positive impact on how people experience life. So we see now, we're in a period now where people's access to that sort of social dynamic of music making is being affected and hampered. But we also see that those professional musicians who are out there delivering what I would argue is this life-saving resource for the public, those professional musicians are having really quite serious, facing quite serious problems in terms of the finances that they're having to pull together in these times, as well as the sort of mental health consequences of not being able to pursue what they've been trained to do.
Well, absolutely fascinating, Aaron. Thanks for your time. I'd like to invite the Dean Ravenscroft, to close the masterclass, and I hope to see you soon. I remember the wine and cheese party we had earlier this year, before the COVID. I wish we could do that again soon, and wishing you the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you, Aaron, for such a lucid and succinct explanation of performance psychology and the Performance Science Initiative. As Aaron noted, this is a challenge-led initiative that's questioning assumptions about how we train performers and pedagogical methodologies. There are 4 grand challenges that he outlined for us: performance education, the physical and psychological systems that enable performance, health and well-being, and interdisciplinary performance science. As he pointed out, there are already advances that have been made that point to the effectiveness of new pedagogical methodologies and of how we can train our performers better using science as a basis. Likewise, thank you, François, for your questions that led us deftly through the information that was presented by Aaron and helped us to reach a deeper understanding of the ways in which things intersect between music, science, technology, and psychology. The Performance Science Initiative is a key part of the mission of the Schulich School of Music, to offer the highest caliber of teaching and learning, grounded in exceptional performance and research in an inclusive and inspiring environment. This mission is aimed at enabling students to achieve their full potential as innovators and cultural leaders, and to enter the world of change that characterizes the 21st century. It is also aimed at helping them to find ways to promote well-being through music. I'd like to thank you all very much for attending today. And before I go, just a note of interest for you. Later today at 7 p.m., two of our Schulich School of Music graduates, marimba player Cristina Marceau and cellist Juan Sebastian Delgado, will be performing at a virtual cocktail hour hosted by the McGill Young Alumni. We encourage you to register for this event and to tune in at 7 p.m. Thank you again for attending today. I wish you all the best for the rest of the homecoming events that you attend, and my best wishes as well for your good health. Goodbye.